So since we teach Hebrew roots, and since we connect the New Testament with the Tanakh, because as I mentioned, it's so important. This weekend, as I'm recording this, this coming Sunday, the church will be celebrating Palm Sunday. And does Palm Sunday have Old Testament roots? Absolutely, yes. Is Palm Sunday mentioned in the Tanakh? Absolutely, yes. Is it mentioned by any of the prophets? Absolutely, yes. We're going to see that in a minute. And people in the church are used to celebrating Palm Sunday. They're used to going and getting the palms and hearing the readings that have to do with Palm Sunday, the Gospels that are the passion and death of the Lord, and that's been custom in the church since the very earliest days, but very rarely are the Old Testament roots of this mentioned, brought up, or taught, or explained. In fact, I can't think of a single time I've ever heard it in any church I've ever been to. But when I first read this passage that we're going to get to in a minute, I was flabbergasted because I had no idea that 500 years before the event, a prophet, a minor prophet, was going to write about the event in pretty clear detail, in a very concise way. And it matched up not only with the events of Palm Sunday, but also explained what the significance of it is, what was going to happen as a result of those events, and how that great event, which was prepared from all of eternity, was also very concise, very compactly written about in the Gospels. I mean, very compactly, and we'll get to that in a little while. So, as you probably know, I'm referring to the prophet Zechariah. Now, Zechariah was writing when the people were returning to the land from the exile in Babylon/Persia. Technically, it was Persia, but it's easier to just call it Babylon since it's called the Babylonian exile. And so the people went back to the land. And as you recall, when the Babylonians came under King Nebuchadnezzar, the people in the land of Judah were taken to Babylon in waves. They took the intellectuals, they took the skilled craftsmen and artisans, and as time went on, they took everybody else. Many of the major prophets wrote during this time. Some of the minor prophets wrote during this time. The people went for a 70-year exile because of idolatry in the southern kingdom. Most of these judgments, like the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, had to do with idolatry. The northern kingdom was irreversibly destroyed. The southern kingdom went into exile, but then came back. And you can read Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, parts of Isaiah, and you can get a whole picture of what that was about. We're not going to go into all the detail now, but eventually, after the time had elapsed, the people were allowed to return to the land. And it began with King Cyrus talking to Ezra, who was a priest and a scribe, that he could go back to the land, that they should rebuild the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. He mentions that scores of times in the beginning of the book of Ezra. And King Cyrus is the mechanism, and he's mentioned by name in Isaiah's prophecies. Long before it happens, he's mentioned by name, and God says, talking to Cyrus through what Isaiah's writing, says, you don't know me, but I'm going to use you, and you're going to help my people go back. People are going to go back to the land. Cyrus gets a word in some sense that the people are allowed to go back. And so the first wave of people go back, Zerubbabel and associates, and they go back and start to rebuild the temple. The foundation of the temple is laid. People celebrate with praise and worship. They have enemies that try to stop the plan, because every plan of God is, the enemy is always trying to thwart every plan. And rebuilding the temple and then rebuilding the wall were no exceptions. So if you read through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you get a very clear picture of that. And so Zerubbabel and others start to build the temple. They deal with the conflict and the resistance to what they're doing. Then Nehemiah, King Artaxerxes interacts with Nehemiah. Nehemiah says he wants to go back and rebuild the wall. The king lets him do it, finances the whole thing. And so when the people are back, going back to the land again in waves, the scripture just talks about people going back, but we have to keep in mind that they had to cover a distance of about 1,000 miles. Going back to a place where the vast, vast majority of them had never been was quite an undertaking. Most of the people had been born and raised in Babylon. After 70 years, the only people that had been in the land before were pretty old. Life expectancy was much shorter then. You had to be at least in your 80s to remember being in the land. And as you might remember in the book of Ezra, it says that when the old people that remembered the first temple saw the foundation of the new temple, they wept because they realized it wasn't going to be as awesome as the first temple. But all that to say that the prophet Zechariah was writing during this time. In fact, Ezra mentions him, Nehemiah mentions him, that he and Haggai are writing, they're prophesying, they're kind of the spiritual directors of all the activity that's going on. And so we don't know exactly, I mean, this would have been roughly about 500 to 510 BC. You don't know exactly when to count the 70 years. The temple, of course, was destroyed in 586 BC. So maybe it was 516. They started going back. But whatever it was in the early fives when Zechariah is writing. And we're going to go to Zechariah 9, verse 9. It's one verse, and it describes something that's going to happen 500 years in the future. Not the following year, not 10 years, 500 years in the future. You know, if you watch it, well, I don't want to get into all that, but, you know, we have in churches now people who claim to be prophets that are constantly prophesying and constantly being wrong about things that they say are going to happen next week or next month or in a year. Zechariah writes this 500 years before. Isaiah writes 700 years before, because they were real prophets filled with the Holy Spirit. And Deuteronomy 18, which you can read for your homework, explicitly says what you do with false prophets. That is, you take them out of the community and execute them. We don't really do that much anymore. But that was in Deuteronomy 18. But anyway, Zechariah 9:9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. One verse. So what is he saying here? The land should be rejoicing when this happens. Zion, Jerusalem should be rejoicing. This is the approach of the Messiah into the city, into the holy city, into the city of the King, capital K. From the book of Genesis, specifically Genesis 3:15. You can read that for your homework too. Which is considered the first proclamation of the gospel, because a redeemer is promised who's going to come from the seed of the woman. The wait for Messiah began. And we don't know how long that was. It shrouded in centuries and millennia. But it was a really long wait. And now Zechariah says he's going to be coming into the city, the one that was promised. And so Jerusalem should rejoice. Zion should be rejoicing. There should be shouting of rejoicing, because this long wait is over with. This long wait for Messiah has come to an end. Now, remember, he's saying this 500 years before. He's not at Palm Sunday. So he says this king is coming, and he's riding on a donkey. Not even an adult donkey. He's riding on a donkey colt, an animal of service, a baby donkey that, as the Gospels say, no one had ever ridden on before. No one had ever used that donkey. Yeshua used it for Palm Sunday. Had to borrow it, by the way. Contrary to what the prosperity preachers might say. He had to borrow a donkey because he didn't own one. And I'm sure the donkey was brought back later. Maybe that donkey was never used for anything again. I don't know, and there's no way to know that. But after a long wait, this king comes in riding on a little donkey. And this, of course, ties in with the idea of the suffering servant. It ties in with Isaiah 52 and 53. It ties in with Daniel talking about how Messiah will be cut off. Nobody wants to know about a suffering Messiah. Nobody wants to talk about an executed Redeemer. People would rather have a military leader who would chase out the Gentiles, reestablish the kingdom of David, reestablish the golden age of when Solomon ruled. That's much more fun to think about than a suffering Messiah. But the Tanakh, of course, and the prophecy in the prophets talks about a suffering servant, talks about a warrior king, talks about battle, talks about a military person, military terms. Book of Revelation very specifically talks about military terms with horses and swords. And so, as you probably know, many of the ancient rabbis concluded there would be two messiahs. There would be Mashiach ben Yosef, the Messiah, son of Joseph, who would be the suffering servant, and Mashiach ben David, who would be Messiah, the son of David, who would be the military one. But we know that it's one and the same. person, one and the same Messiah, the God-man, who is Yeshua. But at this point, as the writer to the Hebrews says, he's made a little lower than the angels because he's here to do the sacrifice, capital S. He's here to be the perfect sacrifice. He's here to become the eternal high priest. He's here to fulfill all the things that Torah and the prophets pointed to. And so he comes in the city on a little donkey after a long, long wait, and the people are supposed to rejoice. Doesn't come on a big white horse, doesn't come surrounded by soldiers, doesn't come with trumpets and heralds and all that stuff that kings always had, doesn't come in a royal coach, riding on a little donkey, an animal of service. Because Yeshua said the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. He will come to be served, but at this point he came to serve. And so this is mentioned in all four Gospels. This is important. And this is, of course, an appointed time. Just like the feast, the Moedim were appointed times. This was an appointed day where this was going to happen. This was planned for all of eternity, as we're going to see with how Yeshua answers the religious leaders. Planned from all of eternity. And just like he came and fulfilled all the appointed times of the feast days, here he is fulfilling this prophecy of Zechariah, because Zechariah points out, even though he looks like a servant and even though he's riding a servant animal, he's bringing salvation with him. Now, that's, in my mind, kind of an unusual thing to say when you're living in a covenant of law and your righteousness is based on how well you do with the law. Zechariah says he's bringing salvation with him. The Hebrew word, of course, is Yeshua, which is also his name. God saves, God can save, it's his name. So he comes on this donkey bringing salvation with him, and this is why Jerusalem is supposed to rejoice. This is why they're supposed to shout for joy, because not only is the long wait over, but he's coming into the city bringing salvation with him. So something is going to happen when he comes into the city that he is going to cause salvation to come through. He's not going to just come to teach and be a philosopher and tell everybody to just get along and be nice. He's not going to tell everybody just do a better job of following all the laws and everything will be fine. He's coming into the city because he's going to be the Passover. And so he's bringing salvation with him. John's account in chapter 12, verse 12, says, the next day, a great multitude that had come to the feast, when they had heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him and cried out, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. Now, we're approaching Passover time. Passover, as you know, is one of the three pilgrimage feasts. So around the time of Passover, there were many, many, many more people in the city than there normally would have been. I don't know, twice as many, three times as many. Pentecost, Shavuot, which is another one of the pilgrimage feasts, that became important because when the Holy Spirit was poured out in the upper room, And Peter went out and preached this awesome sermon, this awesome teaching. He had a ready-made audience because there were thousands of people there that wouldn't normally be there. So Passover is one of the pilgrimage feasts. And so people were coming into the city to get ready for Passover. Now, if you came from wherever, Nazareth, Tiberias, Capernaum, Jericho, Beersheba, wherever you came from, you had to have a lamb. You had to have a lamb for the Passover. The lambs had to be slaughtered at the temple for Passover. It had to be done where the Lord put his name, which was at the temple. So if you came from far away, if you came from somewhere, or if you lived in Jerusalem, which was urban, relatively urban, it was probably pretty crowded. You didn't necessarily have your own flocks of sheep. So you had to buy a lamb. And of course, the lamb had to live with you for 4 days before it was slaughtered for the Passover. And so that particular Sunday, that's called Palm Sunday, that particular Sunday where Zechariah's prophecy is fulfilled, that particular Sunday was when you went around looking for a lamb that you were going to use for the Passover. And so by sundown that night, you should have the lamb at your house, because that coming Friday was Passover. So people were looking for lambs, physical lambs, while the true lamb, capital T, capital L, was coming into the city. Lambs, of course, had to be pure. They had to be without blemish. They had to be spotless. You couldn't just use any old lamb, because these things, these laws prefigured Messiah, who was spotless, without blemish, because he didn't have sin. And because he lived the law perfectly as a man, as Yeshua of Nazareth, he kept the law perfectly and subjected himself to the law, to the covenant. So he was without blemish. He was without sin. He was without any imperfection. So that was the whole point in Torah of the animals without blemish, the perfect animal. You couldn't just sacrifice any old lamb that was sick or had some deformity or had spots on it or whatever. It had to be pure. And so people knew that. If there was any question about whether the lamb was acceptable, you had to have one of the priests come and look at it, because you wouldn't want to take a lamb which was not acceptable for the Passover to the temple. So one of the priests might examine your lamb and say, yes, this is fine, or no, look here, there's a black spot on his foot, can't use that one. So while the priests, while the Levites were examining the physical lambs, they were rejecting the true lamb that was riding into the city, as Zechariah had prophesied. So here we see a group of people that, when they hear that Yeshua is coming into the city, they go start cutting down palm branches and they start yelling Hosanna and waving the branches. Hosanna means save us. Come and save us. Zechariah said the king's bringing salvation with him. The people are yelling, save us. In the other Gospels, we're going to see, we're not going to put all the scriptures up, but to say Hosanna to the Son of David. And when they said that, what were they saying? They were saying, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of David. That's main messianic title. You're the Messiah. Come and save us. This is exactly what Zechariah wrote, that he would come bringing salvation with him. So these people waved the branches just like at Sukkot. Although here they apparently just use palm branches. That's the only branches that are mentioned. But here they quote from Psalm 118, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He's the King of Israel. They're waving branches saying he's the King of Israel. They're waving branches that say Hosanna to the Son of David. And this gets the religious leaders upset. They're quick to point out that Messiah is not going to come from Galilee. In fact, they asked the people if any prophet ever come from Galilee. The short answer is no. Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem, Micah 5:2. Well, they didn't ask Yeshua where he was born, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, so they quote from Psalm 118, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Well, later that week, you can read in Matthew 23, which is one of the most amazing chapters, where Yeshua does just a criticism, I don't know what you would call it, of the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, and so forth. And he says, you won't see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Because they weren't saying it. The common people were saying it. But until they say it, they won't see him again. And they didn't see him again. Now that there is a Sanhedrin, now that there is a priesthood reestablished, now that there is a high priest, they can't say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So we'll see when that's going to happen. But it may fulfill what Paul wrote in Romans 11 of all Israel will be saved. 14. Then Yeshua, when he had found a young donkey, sat on it, as it is written, fear not, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. So again, John references back to Zechariah. References back to the king's coming, but he's riding on a donkey. He comes into the city through the eastern gate. In Psalm 2, it says, God sets his king on the holy hill of Zion. He picks the king. In 1 Samuel, the people picked a king. They wanted a guy they thought was going to be an awesome king. King Saul, and he wasn't an awesome king. God gave in to them, told Samuel, give them what they want, and they'll see. Like he did with many things. With this king, with divorce, with other things. Stiff-necked people, just give it to them. That's what they want. And same things apply to us, by the way. We're stiff-necked and say, so the Lord says, okay, you can have what you want. The culture doesn't want anything to do with Yeshua, doesn't want anything to do with God. Well, then they'll get what they want. So he's the king. He has the authority and the power. And as Paul talks about in Ephesians, he left the glories of heaven to come and live here in what I call our garbage dump. Because no matter where you live in a garbage dump. Every place on earth is sinful and dirty. But he came to live here in order to bring salvation with him. My wife and I did mission work in Mexico for many years, working in physical garbage dumps. And that always struck me that We all live in a moral garbage dump. The people we worked with happen to live in a physical garbage dump. But Paul points out that Yeshua left the glory of heaven to live in a garbage dump, to live in our time and space. So he emptied himself. So this procession that comes in, you got Messiah sitting on this little donkey. You got his disciples, his apostles, who look like a mess, kind of a sorry-looking bunch of guys. All these people, common people, not religious leaders, common people, waving palm branches, calling him Son of David, saying, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." No trumpets, no soldiers, no heralds, no kind of regalia, not exactly a royal procession. But it's the only time Yeshua ever rode in a procession, was ever involved in a procession. So he rides on this animal of service. And it was a cult. Because he has a kingdom which is not of this world. The kings who are kings in this world always show themselves off. Any ruler, any political leader, politicians in general, show themselves off. Like to show their power, like to show people who they are, what they're doing. His kingdom is not of this world. He doesn't debate that with anyone. And you notice through the Gospels when he's confronted and they say, "Who gives you this authority? By what authority?" He doesn't debate his authority with anybody. Doesn't have to. Doesn't spend time debating his authority. His kingdom is not of this world. So Isaiah 52 and 53, which of course, you know, is the only part of the prophets that's never read as the Haftarah reading. It's about the suffering servant. And I've had the opportunity to debate those chapters with many of my Jewish friends who are knowledgeable. Even debated an ultra-Orthodox man at the Western Wall once about Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 has been used since COVID to bring many people in the land to Yeshua. It's really brought a lot of people into the kingdom. So, you know, Isaiah mentioned the kings are going to be startled at some point. You know, all these proud rulers, all these proud kings are going to be startled. His appearance was so marred that he didn't look like a human being. And all of that he describes in 52 and 53. But then he says, kings will be startled by him. So, this was much different than his second coming is going to be. He's not coming back as a suffering servant. He's coming back in triumph as a judge with a sword, with an iron rod, on a white horse, and all the imagery that you see in Revelation that not even going to try to describe. So, like I mentioned earlier, very little preparation was made for this unbelievable event that was prepared before creation. It was go in the city, you'll find a donkey, bring the donkey, tell the guy that the master has need of the donkey. That's how this is going to happen on that particular day. The lamb, capital L, would be presented. Seemingly very little preparation for an eternal event. And so people are procuring a lamb. There's lambs for sale. You need the lamb for the Passover. The lambs have to pass inspection. But the true lamb is rejected. because the religious leaders can't understand this. In the book of Romans, in chapters, I can't remember if it's 2 or 3, but in chapters 2 and 3, where Paul's talking about the law, he says, of all the people who should have known Yeshua as the Messiah, it should have been those guys, because all they did was study Torah and the prophets and the writings. All they did, study, read, debate, and they missed it. So they reject the true Lamb. So there should be shouting and rejoicing because he has salvation with him. He's the God of salvation. The common people are calling Hosanna, while the religious people are saying nothing to see here. This is nothing. He can't be anything. He can't even be a prophet, let alone the Messiah. He's just an ordinary rabbi like so many others, and he has a high opinion of himself, but he's just an ordinary rabbi. So it talks about how multitudes line the streets. The Greek word that's used there means all kind of different people. Not Pharisees, not learned people. They don't hang out with multitudes, but all kind of people were lining the street. And they cut down branches, just like at Sukkot. And they waved branches, and they praised him, and they honored him with branches. So he fulfills Sukkot by coming in a temporary shelter that is like ours and living in community with us. His name will be Emmanuel, God with us. And even branches are waved. So he fulfills Sukkot on many different levels. And it's honor and praise. And Hosanna also, of course, comes from Psalm 118. These are the Hallel Psalms that are recited at the Passover, recited at the Seder. They say Hosanna, they call him the son of David. This is the ultimate messianic title. They're saying, you are the Messiah. You are here to save us. Save us now. Matthew's account, 21:9. Then the multitudes who went before and those who followed cried out, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. There's even hints of what the angels sang when Yeshua was born. Glory in the highest. This is salvation in the highest. Again, Psalm 118, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He's the Messiah. He's the son of David. He's coming in the name of the Lord, and he's here to save us. This wraps up all of Zechariah's prophecy. Really pretty amazing. Now I want to get to Luke 19 because there's another interesting aspect of this here. 1938. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Very reminiscent about what the angels sang at the Nativity when Yeshua was born. So glory to God in the highest, peace, men of goodwill, and all that. And all those things that you hear at Christmas time is almost repeated here by the people. Same sense, a little different wording. And, in Luke's gospel, of course, he weeps over the city and says, you didn't know the time of your visitation. And if you walk down the Mount of Olives, there's a little chapel there at the spot where this happened. Tradition says that he wept over the city and said, well, this is going to be left desolate. I wanted to gather you, but you wouldn't come. And that would have been on the way into the city. But so one group, I'm going to get to these three different groups. One group is saying, this is the Messiah. He's here to save us. There's another group there of people in the accounts that say, who is this? They don't know who he is. Somebody says it's the prophet from Nazareth. He's the glory of Israel, as Simeon said in the temple at his presentation at day 40. He's the glory of Israel. He's the king of Israel, of course, and light to the Gentiles. But there's a group of people that don't know. People don't know who he is. He's the king. It's the city of the king, and they don't know who this is. And so that is another group that's there. He's the Holy One, but they don't know him. Kind of like our time, kind of like every time since then. He's the Holy One, and people don't know him. There are people around us who don't have a clue what we're even talking about when we talk about Yeshua, when we preach the gospel. They have no clue what we're talking about. The third group, of course, are the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the priests, the Levites. They're overlooking the whole scene. And then they address this. There's a lot of commotion going on. It's a pretty wild scene. There's all these people yelling. There's Yeshua on a donkey. The Pharisees are overlooking this whole scene, and they make a demand on him. Luke 19:39. And some of the Pharisees called to him from the crowd, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." In other words, tell them to stop. You should know better than this. They should know better, but you certainly should know better as a rabbi teacher. Make them stop. They are praising you. They're waving branches and saying, Hosanna. This is idolatry. Make them stop that. That's their response. After all the years that they've been studying and debating, that's their response. They feel Yeshua should not be accepting this praise, should not be accepting this worship. This is nothing but idolatry. This is blasphemy. And you, Rabbi, should know that. You should know better, even though these people don't seem to know. So make them stop. But he answered and said to them, I tell you that if these should keep silent, the stones would immediately cry out. In other words, if the people don't praise, if the people don't worship, the stones are going to worship. The stones are going to cry out. So instead of joining in the praise, the Pharisees are enraged. But Yeshua tells them, even if you quiet everyone down, even if the people are suddenly silent, there's going to be praise going on, because this was planned from all eternity. This was planned from before the creation, that I was coming into the city today and I was going to be praised as the king who brings salvation. I am here, he doesn't say it, but he says, I'm here to fulfill the prophecy that Zechariah made 500 years ago. And so if they're quiet, the stones are going to cry out. 5 days later, at the crucifixion, the stones did in fact cry out because there was an earthquake. The stones moved, tombs opened up, stones moved all over the place. He accepts the praise. He doesn't say to the Pharisees, oh, you guys are right. I better quiet them down because they're getting kind of carried away. He says, no, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. If they don't do it, the praise is going to come from somewhere else, because it's the humble people that are praising. The important people aren't praising. The leaders, the theologians, aren't praising. He's going to be glorified whether the people do it or whether the rocks do it. And at the crucifixion, the rocks are going to also be involved. And back to John 12, I love this. 16, his disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things were written about him and that they had done these things to him. So they remembered that this was going to happen. They remembered what was happening, just like when the women got to the tomb the morning of the resurrection, and the angel says to them, remember, he told you when you were in Galilee that he was going to rise on the third day. And then Luke recounts, and then they remembered. Peter and John, who had heard this, run to the tomb because they can't believe it. They said, this sounds like a fairy tale. Then they remembered. And so the roots in the Tanakh from the prophet Zechariah fulfilled. He writes one verse. There's only a couple verses of preparation for this in the Gospels. And then the prophecy is fulfilled in this amazing way where the king actually comes and brings salvation with him. So what an awesome thing to be thinking about as we're approaching Palm Sunday.